Welcome to Let's Take a Walk, brought to you by the Feld Group Institute. In today's episode, we explore USA men's Olympic hockey coach Mike Sullivan's leadership philosophy and what it reveals about leading through technology transformation. When the pressure is constant and the stakes are high, the difference is rarely about talent or strategy alone. It comes down to what leaders build around the work. Let me start off, Charlie, by saying that I love the Olympics. Summer, winter, I love it. The camaraderie that comes between nations, within nations during these events is always really inspiring to me, and I enjoy watching. I know that a lot of that comes from the athletes' stories and the teams that we're able to watch throughout these events. So I want to take just a little bit of time today to discuss a moment in recent Olympic history from the USA-Canada men's hockey game. USA won gold, but on paper, this was by no means a dominant performance. Canada outshot the US by 41-26 and were controlling the game in the second and third periods. And it was just constant pressure from Canada on the US. So shift after shift, this US team is dealing with this pressure, reacting, absorbing, and trying to manage this constant onslaught from Canada. USA was by no means controlling the environment that they were in. This is a team performing under sustained pressure. So despite all that, they stayed composed. They did not tighten up. They didn't start playing not to lose. They held the game and they took it to overtime, and they ended an almost 50-year drought with gold medals for the US men's hockey. The story behind that performance starts with their coach, a gentleman named Mike Sullivan, and his coaching philosophy is grounded in a few principles. So just focus only on what you can control, treat mistakes as learning and not blame, and to make sure that you care about your players before you evaluate them. So he creates this safe zone for learning. So this year, in the weeks leading up to the tournament, there's a lot of pressure on the US, but he didn't frame the moment or let the pressure come through. He sold it to his team as an opportunity. They are staying in the Olympic Village, which is very unusual for all NHL players to be doing. Brothers were staying with brothers, and so they created this environment of trust. So you could really see that trust throughout the tournament. The bigger story that I'm getting to here, Charlie, is this. So when a team is in this gold medal game facing 41 shots of pressure, the difference isn't the talent, which is abundant across both USA and Canada. It's the environment. And it got me thinking about what organizations that we work with are dealing with right now. Because for most leadership teams, technology transformation feels like this game a little bit. There's constant pressure, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's extremely high expectations, and there's not a ton that they can actually control. So at the same time, I would be remiss to not mention the US women's team. Year after year, sustained excellence comes from their culture and consistency. So they, in this tournament, outscored opponents more than 30-1 and dominated possessions the entire tournament. They beat Canada 5-0 earlier in the games, and then they won their gold medal game in overtime. So when you see performance at that level year after year, you're not looking at talent alone. You're looking at the leadership and the culture actively at work. So that brings me back to kind of the bigger leadership question. So I want to talk through a couple of Coach Sullivan's principles with you to get your perspective on how they translate to leading successful technology transformations. Sullivan's known for stripping down larger concepts to very simple, repeatable messages, and so players aren't overthinking the high-pressure moments. So in our transformations, organizations sometimes respond to pressure by adding more frameworks or more complexity. So from your experience, how important is that simplicity and clarity to be able to maintain speed during your transformation?
Yeah, I think so much can be found in sports around the leadership notion and people working their way through difficult times. And, decades ago, I leaned on John Wooden, invited him. He was the coach at UCLA, and he had a pyramid of success, and it was very simple, right? I mean, it just was such common sense, but he had a way of locking all of his players in, as this coach has, into a kind of a simple message and a simple framework. And I think, one of the roles of leadership is to take what are complicated, kind of difficult situations and simplify them, not make them more complicated. But, since it is complicated, the way I've thought about it over time has been through this notion of Zoom book and Zooming. So people that have been around us understand that there are different levels of the story, right? At the highest level, you should be able to get up above the clouds, look down on what you're trying to do, and make that as simple as you possibly can so it could be repeated over and over and over again. And, one thing that I get criticized a lot for by some people is, I repeat myself a lot. I don't repeat myself a lot because it makes me happy. I repeat myself a lot because it takes that kind of repetition to keep it in people's fiber, right? You've got to get the simple story about what we're trying to get done to be not something that people have to think about. It's just instinct. I understand what we're trying to do at that highest level. But as you work your way through a complex transformation or a complex hockey game, it does get down to details matter. So there are different levels of the story that have to be constantly told depending on where you are in the organization. But everybody has got to understand the what you might call the big picture of what we're trying to get done and why what we're here for. So I like the idea of keeping it simple. I like the idea of being able to tell the story over and over again and constantly repeat it. And one of the big flaws that I see in most organizations that have a good articulate leader that's able to describe what we're trying to get done and what the major story is in terms of the transformation, but they only tell it to their direct reports. But their direct reports may and may not turn around and tell it to the people that work for them. So the message is not getting through. I think the thing in sports that helps the coach connect with the players is you have, in hockey or basketball, 20 players. In football, maybe you got 60 and you got one or two coaches. In corporations, you have layers of people that the message stops at certain levels. And people think that since they have it, they don't need to tell it to the next person. So it gets like a telephone game. By the time you get down into the people doing the work, they don't understand what we're doing, why we're doing it. So it really is important to have a good story that's simple and a good story that can be repeated in an elevator ride from the 10th floor to the lobby. And that becomes the backbone that everybody has got to be able to tell. And I think that, the consistency, the simplicity, and, gets people to really get their focus back and be able to stay focused on what they're trying to get done. In the case of the hockey teams and basketball teams and everything else, I mean, it's a great message.
Right.
But
And I think one of the things that Coach Sullivan sticks to that you're suggesting as well is that it's always the same message. And then you're sticking to that same message so that it is repeatable. So one of the things that players say about Coach Sullivan is that the message is always consistent. It doesn't change based on your last game, doesn't change by what happened yesterday in your practice. So during your transformation, you can go through ups and downs, or you can miss a milestone or have a setback, but the message is still the same. From your example, when you're saying, how does this trickle down the telephone, that if that consistency can really be shared.
Right.
One of the other things Coach Sullivan focuses on is role clarity. So players know what their job is and then they're trusted to execute. So in a large technology transformation, sometimes roles can become confusing between IT, within IT, with the business, with product teams. So how critical is role clarity to the success of a transformation, and what are the risks that you run into
Mhm.
when that's missing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think role clarity is critical because there's no way that any one person or any one unit can deliver anything, right? So it takes what has now gotten to be known as a team of teams, right? Where different people have different roles and they've got to be orchestrated to play together. So a development leader can't do their job of delivering solutions unless there are infrastructure teams that can provide infrastructure and security teams that can provide security and database teams that, so we don't have a situation where any one group or any one person can deliver. So having role clarity and roles and responsibility and accountability for each one to show up, because for one of a nail, you won't deliver anything. And you can see it why team sports are such a good example that you could put in front of people, because there's no way that without a team win, an individual can win anymore. But everything else requires a different position player, an offensive team, a defensive team, in our case, infrastructure, application development, architects. Uh, and unless everybody understands what we talked about before, what are we trying to get done, right, in the larger picture? But then what is my role and what is my team's role in that execution side? You just can't win. You can't have one or the other. You've got to have both.
In that same vein, and then when you were talking about also taking accountability for your role, um, Coach Sullivan thinks about creating an environment where there's accountability without fear. So he
Mm-hmm.
holds very high standards, but also creates an environment where mistakes are treated as learning opportunities and mistakes aren't shutting people down. So I know that in transformations, leaders can struggle with the balance between accountability and then kind of the safety within their culture. So, what does a healthy accountability look like during a transformation, and how could a leader create that type of environment?
Well, I think holding people accountable is critical because, again, all of these different layers of a simple story, right? The team of teams, and takes an orchestration between different roles and responsibilities and accountability all matter, and they come together. And if you have a team and everybody's counting on each other and one part of the team doesn't show up, right, and doesn't execute against it, again, you're in a situation where you can't deliver it. Well, and I learned this, way back at PepsiCo, is it's okay if you have trouble as long as you come forward once you know you have the trouble. So you go into a lot of organizations where, this red, yellow, green, where green is good and red is trouble. I've gone into accounts where, or into organizations where everything is green and it immediately starts going red and it never goes to yellow. And that's because the teams are trying to cover up their problem until they can't cover it up anymore. Well, most likely they're covering it up because they think they can catch up. So, one of the requirements I've always had is it's okay to go from everything's good, everything's green on the dashboard to yellow, because then you have time to go in and help them. You have time to adjust. You have time to put more resources on it or slow some things down or, kind of work your way through it with the team. But if it goes to red, that's not good. And you haven't had a chance. So the idea is if you have something that's not working, you're accountable to come forward and say, I'm having trouble. The leader is then accountable to say, okay, I'm here to help you, not to punish you. So let's figure out what we can do to get this back on track. And in 9 out of 10 cases, if you know about the problem soon enough, it's easy to get it back on track because you could apply more resources or do something different, right? So, but you've got to have the trust across the team that it's okay to say things are not going so good. And and it could be because somebody on the team got sick, or they had a problem in their family, or they had a health issue, and they just keep trying to keep it away, right? Because they think they can make it up. So that's it, and that gets to, does the leader stay engaged enough to know that the person that's having the trouble is having the trouble, or are they so distant that they're unapproachable, and therefore
Right.
nobody tells them anything that's going wrong.
Right. Coach Sullivan and USA men's hockey review video from practices and games. And so Coach Sullivan has created an environment that's pretty unique within his teams where players don't come in thinking that they're going to get yelled at. So they do have those opportunities to be in the yellow, to see a mistake up on screen and know that it's going to be a learning opportunity and not something that they're going to be penalized for. So to
Right.
your point about creating that environment, Coach Sullivan has set up an environment where the team feels comfortable in like a constant feedback loop with these videos that then builds that trust both together, but and also between the athletes and the coach, and obviously is directly related to what you're saying between the leaders and creating environments where there is a yellow possible and that it's something that would be faced together and green doesn't go directly to red. So
Yeah, and I think that's the point. It's not so much that you're not going to get reds or you're not going to have trouble. You're not going to have problems, right? Because nothing is. If you never have trouble, it means you haven't been aggressive enough about setting the plan, right? But if you're a good leader, you set a tough plan and then you manage to it. So you will get times where you've got to go in and say, I can't make that date, right? I mean, it's happened to me more than a few times, but it can't just be a surprise, right?
right.
So,
And the same thing
uh,
with Sullivan's teams is that he's trying to have them stay present and not dwell on those mistakes or the
right.
scoreboard at the moment. So he emphasizes kind of next shift
Yeah,
mindset. So as soon as you go over the boards again, we're not dwelling on the last mistake. You're going to focus on your execution right now. And so
right.
in transformations where this takes years, you have to have leaders keep team focus on the execution and not the red mistake from last week. Because as you said, they're going to come up.
Right. But you have to create an environment because the first time somebody comes forward and says they're having trouble, if you punish them, if you criticize them, right, then you'll never get them to come forward and you'll be surprised all over the place. So, everything gets down to culture and environment. That's why the coach's philosophy is so good. That's why,
Yeah.
because he creates an environment where it's okay.
So he took over the Pittsburgh Penguins in 2015, and they were loaded, like star studded with talent. but they were horrible because they had this environment that didn't have any sort of trust, you didn't have the opportunity to be honest. There was no kind of feedback loop for your learning. What he described as kind of a dark cloud over that locker room. And he stepped in and changed that culture, and they went on to win the Stanley Cup. So transformation failure could be viewed in lots of different ways. But the way that you're talking about it, it seems like a lot of times those are failures of culture versus technology.
Yeah. Yeah. I would even narrow it down to failures of leadership culture, right? Because I will tell you that in almost all of the years I've been doing this, I've gone into places that were failing and replaced a few of the leaders. And that same group of people, without having to replace much of the workforce, have succeeded, and they've gone from losing to winning just because you've changed the leadership and the culture, and it's become connected and encouraging as opposed to punishing and bureaucratic. So, the leader sets the tone, right? But the talent is there in most cases. I can't think of a company that I've been involved with that we've had to replace much of the workforce, right? And they went from losing to winning just because of the way they got up in the morning and looked forward to coming to work and felt encouraged, not punished. That kind of got to where they respected their teammates. And so when people say, sports obviously is a team thing, well, business is a team thing, family is a team thing, right? And the people that are in charge of the family, the parents, create the environment that the kids can flourish in or not, right? If you criticize a kid all the time and don't encourage them, you get what you get, right?
Yeah, those
So,
a leader's behavior during those high pressure situations
yeah,
going to dictate how an organization or a family or a team is going to respond.
yeah. And we've seen it over and over and over again, right? Change the leadership and the department or company becomes successful, right? Change it back to something else and punishing and egocentric, and it becomes the same people can't win because they don't feel comfortable. They don't feel at all safe in saying, I messed this thing up, or I underestimated this, or, anything that would be criticized. And I continue to watch leaders, punish their people, make public spectacles of their people. It's crazy, right? In terms of, at this point, we should know what it takes to build a winning team like they did in Pittsburgh with the same talent, right? And that's got to be the leadership.
Yeah. And especially when I was watching this game, the gold medal men's game,
Mm-hmm.
the US did not win, like I said, because they were controlling the game. They won because everybody knew their role. They were able to play quickly. The messages from their coaches were consistent. They had been in an environment where it was safe for them to fail and to learn. They focused on what they could control. They had relationships and trust. Ultimately, even in a transformation, there's a lot of pressure, but their pressure was framed as an opportunity. So
Mm-hmm.
it was just exciting to see. And I always think of these transformations and the opportunities that leaders have when you see a really good coach and you see a really good leader. That can make all the difference in the same workforce with a couple changes of leadership or a different attitude from leadership. That can really be the differentiator.
Yeah. Well, again, I think sports is a wonderful microcosm for business leaders to learn from. But as importantly, I think it's why parents should encourage their kids to be in sports. Doesn't matter what the sport is. It is a give and take and a learning when you're young to see what it takes to win. So when you get into a corporate job or any kind of a leadership position in the military, anywhere, you can find a lot of learnings from when you were 8 years old, and this coach encouraged you different than when you were 8 years old or 10 years old, and this coach was constantly screaming at you for how stupid you are, right? I mean, it's exciting to watch the young kids play soccer, to watch them swim, to watch them play baseball. And, so much to learn that helps build their inner thought process around how they felt when they were a player versus now that you're a leader or you're a coach. What do you believe in? Right.
Yeah.
So,
It doesn't matter the type of team, but the pattern still looks the same. And
yeah.
the environment that you create determines the performance you're going to get out of your team. The operating environment leaders create, the culture of accountability, trust, clarity, and consistency, determines whether teams tighten up or rise to the moment. If you're leading through change, the question isn't just, is the strategy right? It's, have I created the environment where my team can win? Thanks for joining us. See you next time.